Hi there, welcome to your online lesson looking at education and government policies. We are going to spend a few different lessons looking at this topic. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview today, and we're going to just dive into one kind of small aspect of it. But this is quite a sizable part of our education unit, and you'll be pleased to know it's the last part of our unit. So after this, we're going to move on to crime. But we're going to be looking at how education and how the education system in the UK has changed depending on some of the policies and the laws that different governments have introduced. Because whether we like it or not, education is kind of one of the political footballs that gets pushed around by government and in elections, and every government that comes into power promises to do something to improve education. And we're going to look at some of the key policies that have changed education, and it's kind of up to you to decide whether or not it's improved it or not. But we're going to be looking at each of them in terms of describing what they are, what their purpose was, how they've changed the education system that we know today, and then we're going to evaluate them through the eyes of different sociological perspectives. So to start, if we can look at the aims for the overall topic, we are going to be looking at three main education policies since the 1980s. Okay, that's going to be the 1988 Education Reform Act, and then the policies in 1997 and 2010. And you need to be able to describe the content and the purpose of each of those policies, and you have to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of each policy through the eyes of different sociological perspectives. They are the aims for the topic, and these are the aims for today. So today we are going to look only at the national curriculum, and that is as part of the 1988 Education Reform Act. Okay, and we are going to be able today to evaluate that national curriculum through different perspectives, and that's all we're looking at today. So a little bit of a shorter one, and we're going to be sort of building into a bit more length in later sessions. 1988 was a big year for Margaret Thatcher. She was Prime Minister at the time, and this was the year where she became Britain's longest serving Prime Minister. Michael Jackson was #1 at this time in 1988 in April with Man in the Mirror, and if you look like this, then you were cool. And I think a lot of us might come out of lockdown with hair looking a little bit like this. How times have changed. 1988 is also the year of the Education Reform Act. Okay, and it was a really big change in education, where we saw a lot of the things that we take for granted now. We saw a lot of them introduced in this year. And the national curriculum was one of those, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But before that, I would like you to imagine, a bit of a strange one this, I'd like you to imagine that you run a lemonade stand. Okay, so you and your mates have got yourself some lemons, and you've got yourself some sugar, and you have made some lemonade. And you are selling that lemonade on the street corner. Once we come out of lockdown, obviously, and we're able to sort of leave our homes and start, you know, living normal life again, you've got yourself some lemonade and you're selling it on the street corner. Now, a couple of roads down, a couple of miles away from you, there is another group who's also selling lemonade, and there is another group in another town, and you know, across the whole area there are different groups selling lemonade, but each of them are doing it slightly differently. Each of them use a little bit of different ingredients, and some of them have got more kind of processes than others. Some of them have got different machines that they use. You're kind of stuck with your basic lemons and sugar, and you haven't got much else, and it's getting a little bit out of hand because everyone's doing it a little bit differently. And imagine there was this kind of overseer, this kind of lemonade authority, that said, you know, actually we need to make it a little bit more structured, because we can't tell if the lemonade you're selling is any good because your neighbour is selling completely different lemonade and it's not really the same as yours, so we can't really measure them against each other. So what the Lemonade Authority do is they come along and say, right, the rules are now you can only use 6 lemons per jug of lemonade, and you can only use this much sugar, and you've got to make the best lemonade you can out of those ingredients, and everyone's got the same kind of level playing field. And that makes the lemonade industry a lot more standard, and it also makes it a lot easier to judge which are the best lemonade sellers and which are the worst ones, because everyone's got the same process. Okay, this is the kind of logic that was behind the national curriculum. The national curriculum was introduced in 1988. And before the national curriculum came along, schools were able to decide what they taught their pupils based on what they kind of thought was best. And this was kind of guided a little bit by the examiners and a bit by employers and industry. But really, schools had quite a lot of freedom about what they would teach their pupils. The only subject that was compulsory across every school was RE, big up for RE. But that was a completely different time to what we're used to now. And so schools before then had a lot more freedom, and the government wanted to make it a lot more standardized, a little bit like our Lemonade Authority. They wanted to be able to measure the quality of different schools, and the national curriculum was one of the ways of them doing this. So what they introduced was they introduced a system whereby students and schools could be measured against national standards, because the national curriculum came into place, and it said that every school that was under a local authority, so for example a comprehensive school or a state school, every school that was governed by a local authority had to teach this list of information and this list of subjects. So you have to teach English, maths, science, history, geography, and within each subject you've got to teach these topics. So Shakespeare, Churchill, evolutions, photosynthesis, equations, etc. Every school has a list of subjects and topics that they've got to teach, and at the end of that all, we're going to assess the pupils on how much they've learned and how much they've understood in these exams called GCSEs. And the idea was that if we can make everyone teach the same stuff and the same topics and the same content, and then we can examine students at the end of that time, we can see if a school has done a good job or a bad job, high quality or low quality education, good progress or not good progress, and if a student has done well versus other schools in the country, because everyone's learning the same, or at least should be. And so therefore, if everyone is learning the same, it's a lot easier to measure a child against their peers and to measure if the school is high or low quality. The national curriculum, that was kind of the first aim, was to get this standardized measure in place. The second aim was to provide a greater amount of equality for education for all people, because pre-1988, as I said, schools were kind of teaching what they thought was the best thing to teach, and it was guided by employers and examiners. There were certain subjects that were not available or on offer to all pupils. So if we take science as an example, science typically, and still largely today, has been this kind of boys subject where the large number of boys have taken science as an option and not so many girls. One of the requirements of the national curriculum was that it was now compulsory for all pupils to study at least some level of science up to GCSE level, and then if you wanted to, you could specialise further at GCSE and also at A level. But it's making science available for all pupils, which is kind of raising those expectations for everybody. This is a subject everyone's going to do, not just the boys or not just people that want to. Okay, so it's about making it available to everyone and about raising the standards for everyone. And that individual progress of a school and a pupil was assessed by national tests. Okay, so if you just recap that kind of whole process, pre-1988, schools are kind of teaching what they want, how they want, thinking what they think is best, and not really looking at a national picture. Because of this, it's really hard to measure one school against another, because one school is providing this, another school is doing something completely different. You can't measure those, and therefore you can't say categorically school A is better than school B, because they're different, they're doing different things. Therefore, the government wanted a way of measuring schools so that they could say these are the best schools in the country and these are the worst schools in the country. And therefore, they created a curriculum that was the same for everybody. And therefore, everyone has to learn that, and every school has to teach that if they're governed by a local authority in England. The result of that is the national curriculum that we now see today. Now, academies, private schools, a lot of schools don't have to use it, but most schools in the country are governed by local authorities, and therefore most schools in the country do use the national curriculum and do have to follow it by law. Now, if we were to look at some of the perspectives that would evaluate the national curriculum, we're going to look at functionalists, Marxists and feminists, and it's really, really important before we go into this that you understand the sociologists in brackets such as Durkheim, Parsons, Bowdery, Oakley. They didn't study the national curriculum directly. Okay, so this is not what they have said about the national curriculum. This is what they have said about education in general. And we are using those comments and applying it to the national curriculum. So please don't think that Durkheim, because he wasn't even alive in 1988, so please don't think that Durkheim said the national curriculum provides this, but he does believe certain things about education. Okay, so we are taking pre-existing sociological theories and applying them to the national curriculum, which is something that you can do as long as you make it clear. So Durkheim might say about the national curriculum, it's a great thing because it creates greater social solidarity. Remember Durkheim's big things of 3 S's: school being a mini society, creating social solidarity and giving us skills for work. That second S, social solidarity, is all about bringing people together under an umbrella of shared values. If we are teaching pupils the same information from Bradford to Bournemouth, then they are going to be united across the society with a shared understanding of key ideas and key values. So the national curriculum gets a big tick from Durkheim. Parsons also would have liked it. He would say that the national curriculum allows students to be judged on universal standards, not particularistic ones. Okay, remember those particularistic standards were standards that were set by a specific family. So my family lets me eat my dinner under the table, whereas your family expects you to sit at the table to eat dinner. So you can see our 2 different families have very different standards of how we eat our dinner. Universal standards are ones which are applicable across a society and therefore are a level at which we can measure whether or not people are doing well. The national curriculum is a universal standard across local authority schools in England, and therefore we can measure very clearly a school's progress against another's. Parsons also would have liked the national curriculum because it, in theory, enables education to be meritocratic. If we go back to our lemonade example at the start, we talked about the fact that a couple of miles away from your lemonade stand, there was another group of people who were producing lemonade using fancy machines that you haven't got access to. So of course, their lemonade's going to be better than yours because it's made from a machine rather than from, you know, your hands squeezing the lemons into the lemonade. It's not meritocratic because one group has more money than another. Now, if we have a national curriculum and every school is meant to be teaching the same information and every student is meant to be learning the same information, then the students who learn it best, i.e. have the highest ability and work the hardest, are going to be the ones that do the best in education. It's not about the students kind of getting the best education themselves, it's about the fact that everyone's learnt the same, therefore who's learnt it best, which then allows it to be a lot more meritocratic. And the students who achieve the highest grades deserve them because they were the most able and they worked the hardest. So functionalists would absolutely love the national curriculum. Marxists and feminists, however, not such a great fan. Marxists would say, and Bowes and Gintis would say, that the national curriculum would reinforce the ruling class ideology. If a Marxist were to look down the list of the curriculum on offer and the different subjects and different content on offer of the national curriculum, they would say it's very ruling class heavy. So you're looking at a lot of people who went to private school, politicians, Winston Churchill, key inventors, all members of the bourgeoisie. Okay, and so therefore you're looking at the history of the bourgeoisie and not looking at the history of the proletariat. You're looking at some of the values of the bourgeoisie, such as spending money, earning money, industrialization, inventions, that kind of stuff. All right, so it's all about promoting the ruling class ideology. And also they would say, Bowes and Gintis, that it's not meritocratic, and that meritocracy is a myth, because remember, not all schools have to follow the national curriculum. Those that are state schools governed by local authorities do, but our school is an academy. Other schools are private schools. They haven't got to follow the national curriculum, and therefore they can still pump more into the students than other schools are able to, and therefore it's not meritocratic, it's not fair for all. A feminist would argue that the national curriculum reinforces the patriarchy, because a lot of the people that we study through the national curriculum are male. The achievements of men are massively outweighing the achievements of women in the national curriculum. In fact, a lot of the time the national curriculum kind of ignores a lot of the key achievements of women, but really focuses on those of men. So a feminist would say that it's reinforcing the patriarchy. A Marxist would say it's reinforcing the ruling class ideology, and a functionalist would love it because it's social solidarity and meritocracy. Okay, so which of these three perspectives do you agree with the most? This is your final task. I would like you to describe what the national curriculum is, when it was set up, and what it hoped to achieve. What were the key purposes? There's two of them. What were the key purposes of the national curriculum? If you want to, you can do some more research looking at gov.uk, where you can read the national curriculum and you can see what's inside of it. And then I want you to explain each sociological perspective on the national curriculum, remembering that it's not this sociologist actually wrote about the curriculum, but rather what they might say about it. And finally, which perspective do you agree with the most and why? Thanks very much.